All right, we're live. We've got people coming in. Great. Hi, welcome. Looks like we've still got people joining us. My name's Dr. Liz Olson. I'm a professor of anthropology at Southern Utah University. And it's been my pleasure to help put this amazing panel together in collaboration with the folks at the University of Utah Center for Latin American Studies. And tonight's panel is called Social Justice for Latinx Americans and Communities. And this comes in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month. So as we're thinking this month about recognizing the ways that Hispanic and Latinx individuals and community and groups have contributed to US society, we also want to consider the current conditions of life for Latinx and Hispanics in the US. So social justice is a concept that refers to the achievement of equal opportunities and access to pathways for those opportunities in a society. On tonight's panel discussion, our presenters are going to address different ways that social justice is sought for Latinx and Hispanic Americans. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their experiences and their thoughts on social justice for Latinx communities. So let's start tonight with Ms. Mayra Sedano of Comunidades Unidas.
Hi everyone, I'm Mayra Sedano, and I have the privilege to be the Executive Director for Comunidades Unidas, or CU, a local nonprofit here in our state. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in Jalisco, Mexico, and I immigrated to the US as an undocumented immigrant when I was 11 years old. I started my activism in the immigrant rights movement when I was 15, when for the first time I marched to the state capitol to demand a halt on deportations. Ever since then, I've been very active in my community. After I graduated from the University of Utah, right after, I was able to join Comunidades Unidas. So I've been there for the last 10 years, a whole decade. And for the last 8 months and a half, I've been the new executive director. And I also want to share with you that obviously as a former undocumented immigrant, I benefited from in-state tuition, and I also benefited from having a lot of support to actually attend college and graduate. I'm very passionate about social justice, in particular about immigrant rights. And in a few minutes, I'll be telling you a little bit about the work that we're currently doing at Comunidades Unidas, but also how you all can get activated in the work that we're currently doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayra. That's an exciting information about the work that you're doing in Comunidades Unidas. And next, we're going to hear from Dr. Christina Baines.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the panel. My name is Christina Baines. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Gutman Community College, and that's a college of the City University of New York. My research is in Belize. I've also done research in Guatemala and Peru, and more recently in New York and Los Angeles. And I look at the connection between heritage practice, traditional ecological practice, and identity, and how that affects health, how traditional practices affect health. And through my work in Belize, I work in primarily in a Maya community. I've been involved in a lot of the struggle for the communities there to win land rights from the government of Belize. And so that is one manifestation of my activism when it comes to communities that have been marginalized over many years. Through my research, I like to involve students in my research, and that's a form of social justice activism. We look at how different communities in New York and Los Angeles intersect with health and heritage, how they're communicating their practices and how they're embodying those practices. I also co-direct an organization called Cool Anthropology, and that's is directed by this imperative for academic research to get out to a wider audience. And we have a couple of projects that hopefully I'll talk a little bit more about. One is called Ethnography Matters, and it's about why ethnography matters to help us cut through fake news and different kinds of media that we see. And there is an alumna of Gutman Community College and also of Baruch College called, her name is Hania Delgado. She works on that project. I have other students that work on an interactive documentary that's in process called Shifting Stereotypes. So Cool Anthropology takes academic research and kind of makes it available to a wider audience. So I'm also involved, I'm recently on the advisory board of the Pandemic Journaling Project, which hopes to capture the voices of those that are typically not heard when we're writing histories. So it's sort of co-writing the history of the pandemic, and my students are involved in writing that history, and other students throughout CUNY and the country and even the world. So you can get involved in that as well to kind of make voices heard of experiences of the pandemic. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you all and being here, and thank you very much for having me.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. All right, and our next panelist, let's jump over to Dr. Munoz, Ed Munoz from the University of Utah.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation to speak to folks. I identify myself as a Nebrasqueño, and for some people that don't know Spanish, that is basically the term I made up for a native Nebraskan. Born and raised in Nebraska and the panhandle of Nebraska. We are working on our 5th generation of Western Nebraskans. My folks were sugar beet workers in the panhandle back in the 50s. They migrated from Texas. So I also tell my students, Nebrasqueño por rumbo de Texas, so by way of Texas. My folks were both in Texas and migrated in the 50s with their respective families. That's where they met and fell in love and had 6 kids. I'm the only male among my siblings. So my sisters, well, we won't get into that, okay? 5 sisters and myself. But that's kind of fueled what I do in the classroom and my research. My research focuses on the Latina experiences outside of traditional enclaves. Most of my work has been focused on communities in Nebraska and also in Wyoming. I was at the University of Wyoming for quite some time. And then I started my career at Iowa State University. So I've been along this I-80 corridor for quite some time. And my research focuses on racialization processes and how it impacts criminal justice decision-making. I'm currently working with the Salt Lake Peer Court, which is a diversion program here in Salt Lake, and evaluating the program and to help them improve and to spread the word of all the good work they're doing. I have a longer term project using oral history methodologies as well. Some of my students are doing oral histories this semester as well, similar to kind of the things that Dr. Baines was mentioning earlier. But my project is a kind of looking at the construction of Latinidad or Latinx identity. I know terms are not as popular as they once were at some point in time. But in any case, we're looking at the construction of Latinx identity in the Intermountain West. And I'm even kind of looking at it like a multi-century long process, because for folks that don't know, Latinx identity, where there be, Spaniards and mestizos coming with Spaniards to help explore, conquer, and colonize, and the whole bit. That's been happening in the Intermountain West for way back since the 1600s. So that's a longer term project I'm working on. And I also like to, I'm an advocate of the community engaged learning as well with my students. I think I'm going to stop there because I don't want to take too much time. And if we have questions, we can go back later. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Another panelist, Dr. Enrique Ochoa from Cal State.
Sorry, mute myself. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. My name is Enrique Ochoa. I'm professor of Latin American Studies and History at Cal State University, Los Angeles. I want to thank everyone, right, for being here. I mean, Hispanic Heritage Month, as we're in it now, right? This goes back, we need to honor Dr. Carter Woodson. Goes back to Negro History Week in 1926, right? To encourage people to use 1 week to teach about Black history in school. Of course, it was ignored and it's been ignored. But Hispanic Heritage Month comes about, right, in 1968 through the work of Ed Roybal, as a result as well of the Chicano student walkouts that happened in 1968. And so these are important, really, spaces to begin to talk about history and cultures of people who've been historically and currently oppressed, right, through the structures of racism, of capitalism, of cis heteropatriarchy. And right, in an oppressive society, there are a few spaces where we can, right, we can insert ourselves and begin to at least tell those stories. And again, this is an important space to do this, because these systems of oppression, they persist. They persist not just in schools going back to 1926, but they continue in K through 12, right, where students have a very little opportunity to learn anything about the rich, diverse communities, right, in the United States, to see any kind of really critical history of the United States that connects us, and this is part of the work I'm interested in doing, connects us through imperialism, through the expansion of the US Marines in other places, and economic policies to other areas that really then push people out, right, in a form of an expulsion, a despojo, as they would say in Spanish, right, kind of a violent destruction. And so again, these are important spaces, and one way I like to do this and talk about this is within the K through 12 process. Latinx and Hispanic, as Dr. Munoz says, right? These are tricky terms. They're used for political mobilization, some right other reasons as well. But at the same time, they also hide and obscure the rich pluriversity of histories, of languages, of cultures, of experiences, right? Latin Americans, Latinx people, right, are indigenous, right? Large percentage of indigenous and indigenous migrants, Zapotecos, Mixtecos, right, coming from all various parts of Mexico, Guatemala, other regions, a large, of course, Afro-Latino population, because 10 times more Africans were ripped from their lands and enslaved and brought to Latin America than were in the US. Therefore, the large, really, right, Afro presence is so important. And my work then seeks to kind of visibilize, which has been made invisible in the process of colonialism and the process of coloniality, as some scholars term it. I'm from Los Angeles, right? So I'm on Tongva land. I'm on Tongva land that was taken by the Spaniards, and then by the Mexicans, and then by the US. However, Los Angeles in 1781 was settled by people from northern Mexico, what we call northern Mexico, Sinaloa, Sonora, Nayarit, right? More than half of them were of African descent. And on the census, they were Black and mulatto, more than half of them. And of course, that's a fact. They spoke Spanish, obviously, because they were in the Spanish world, but it shows that diversity. But of course, there's been a long history to suppress that, to hide that. The LA city founders worked hard to whiten, right, what Los Angeles was, and a Spanish fantasy past they had of it. And the process, right, we lose that history. I'm the son of a Sicilian New York mother and a Nicaraguan immigrant father. So imperialism is very close to my heart. It's why I'm here. I was named Enrique by them in Los Angeles, but my father, as a good Central American, was named Henry. Raised in Nicaragua, and he was named after his uncle's wife, his aunt's husband, Sergeant Major Henry Cloth of the United States Marine Corps, who was part of the invasionary forces of Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, right, where the Marines were from 1909 to 1933. And so when my family was being pushed out of Nicaragua for political reasons, where else are they going to come? They're going to come to the country that already shifted their gaze away from Latin America and to the US. And so those kind of processes right, helped to really transform life for large numbers of us. A lot of my research is focused really on critical food history in Mexico and Central America and in the US. So one of the things I spend a lot of time on is the history of tortillas. And of course, tortillas are great. Hopefully you get some in Southern Utah and wherever else you are, right? But tortillas are one of these stories where the knowledges of indigenous women in Mesoamerica has been erased. Indigenous women who figured out the scientific process to add nutrients to it, right? To make it a nutritious product, nutritious food, wherever else maize is eaten, corn is eaten as a staple food, people tend to get diseases. But not in Mexico and not in Central America because of the nixtamalization process, right? And all throughout history, and I won't go through it, the whole history, but as tortillas get sold and marketed by corporations and by nations, indigenous women are erased from that story. So my work, and we can hopefully talk more about it, deals with, right, visibilizing what's been erased. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you for that introduction. And the topics, well, I'm sure we'll come back to. And our last and certainly not least panelist is Dr. Ruth Gomberg Munoz.
Hi, everyone. I don't want to go after Dr. Ochoa anymore. That is a tough act to follow. No, thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm just really honored to be here with you all. And this is my classmate, Tinieblas. He likes to work with me here. I'm an anthropologist at Loyola University, Chicago, and broadly speaking, my work, my life's work as an anthropologist and otherwise is with undocumented people and their US citizen family members. I'm part of a mixed status family and community myself. And so just to give you sort of the short version, my early research sought to understand how being undocumented affected the ways in which people approach, their work and family and household lives. And then my second major project followed undocumented people and their family members through immigration processing as they sought to change their immigration status. And I'm currently now working with deportee rights activists in Mexico City and in Chicago. And so, just to talk a little bit about the role that activism plays in my work, I was actually an immigrant rights activist long before I was an anthropologist. It sort of led me into anthropology, and being an anthropologist and working with community organizers has taught me to be a better activist. So I've been working on trying to deepen and make more meaningful the community collaborations that my work takes. And so with that said, I want to give a shout out to my compas who are working with me on this deportation project. I'm working with Rey Wences here in Chicago, along with Rosy Carrasco and Martin Unzueta. And then in Mexico City, I want to give a shout out to Ana Laura Lopez, Dolores Unzueta, Esme Flores, Maggie Loredo, and I think that covered everybody. But if I forgot you, I love you and I'm sorry.
Awesome. So many good things going on. Thank you guys for all being here. Really, this is a really neat and cool experience. So thank you all for coming tonight and sharing some of the work that you're doing and your experiences and perspectives and knowledge about Latinx and social justice issues. So I want to open up, we actually have some of the Q&A box, and you guys are welcome, participants are welcome to use the chat room, but also if you have questions that come up, please submit them to the Q&A so that we can address those. And we have a question that's already been submitted. So let's talk about this. The question says, Dr. Munoz's reference to his Nebraskan identity sparked a couple of questions. Who identifies as Latinx, and what are the parameters of that identification? And then is there a pecking order, air quotes, among communities of differing Hispanic heritage, class, origin, country of origin, and periods of arrival in the US that diminish the potential aggregated political power all Hispanic residents might otherwise wield in this country? Boom. That's a comment question, huh? So it's a two-part question, and panelists, you're welcome to address that as you feel appropriate. We'll give a couple minutes for each panelist.
Oh, I'll start if you don't mind. Is that okay? All right. Yeah. Even though I identify as a Nebrasqueño, I also identify as Latinx, and I have a hard time with the Latinx versus Latinx, and because I've heard so many different pronunciations, and it's a term that is problematic as well. And just what was within the question as well, there is a pecking order among Latinx communities. Okay, it's much like what we see in general society as well, by race, by class, by gender, sexuality, the whole bit, and you know, even by Latinx groups as well. Cubans were favored immigrants in the late 1950s throughout the 60s and that. Because they were escaping communism and things like that. And because of their favored treatment, they received a lot of assistance. And this is something that we teach in you know, intro to Chicano Latino experiences and whatnot. And so there are these pecking orders. Right now, I'm seeing data that's South and a lot of South American migrants are doing very well educationally and not only educationally, economically and whatnot. The thing I try to do and try to tell my students, I do explain these terms to them because, and much like Enrique was talking about earlier, this term does erase, Latinx does erase different identities. And that's something that we need to strive within our community. There was an article that's been going around for almost a year or so. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's the article of the X and Latinx represents 4 wounds, okay? And those 4 wounds are to remind us in all of our Latinx communities of, you know, that we have to fight and struggle against colonialism as well as anti-Blackness and femicide, and we need to better articulate all of our experiences as well. Again, these terms, you know, and the other term that I prefer over Latinx is Chicano. You know, and for me, Chicano is an ideology, a philosophy that, you know, gained a significant traction in the 60s to 70s. And the term has gone through so many different types of iterations that, you know, but for me, the bottom line is that somebody that strives for social, economic, and political justice, and not just within the Chicano community, but in all communities throughout society. So I'll pass it along to others. Hope that answered part of the question that Stan, I think it's Stan, had. Okay.
Yeah. Before you move on though, just a quick follow-up. What were the 4 wounds that the X referred to?
Colonialism, anti-Blackness, femicide, and articulation. Okay, I could probably pass, well, I tried to find, I'll find that article and I'll pass it along, okay?
And gender nonconforming.
Right.
Yes, that's kind of, yes, but yeah, that's the other thing too. And that kind of falls within the argument that this author was making within femicide as well. You know, particularly for trans people in not only here in the United States but in Latin America as well. Thanks.
I'm wondering if there are some other panelists that had some comments to share with regards to that question.
I could say something. Yeah, so I identify as Latinx and Centroamericano and Central American, right? Latinx in part because it is that pan identity that's there, and so there's some political reasons for that. Although I'm very aware of the limitations of it, and the way it could be used to pit groups against each other. So I think these terms are very fluid. Again, I like the Latinx in particular, right? As someone who identifies as gender nonconforming, right? That's an important concept, and it helps us to see, right, the complexities of us all and move us away from these binary thinkings. But also, Central American is very important, especially in the U.S. and given the long history of U.S. invasion in Central America, given the long history as well of migration of Central Americans and the history of Central American invisibility. Invisibility in a variety of ways, in terms of it being in the U.S., being marginalized even within the Latinx communities. That happens, of course, and then being, yeah, I guess I can just, I'll just stop it at that, right? So again, using these identities as a way just to uplift these various experiences that are there. And I think that's really important to do. And as far as the second aspect of that question about political power and larger political power, right? I think one can't expect, right, unity, political unity among Latinx people, right, because of the significant diversity, right, that Dr. Munoz has talked about. That being said, there are definitely, right, themes and topics around which people can begin and are able to connect, but also need to be connecting as well with other working class communities.
Great. Continue submitting your questions, everybody. I had a question, and just generally to all the panelists, how do we encounter racism in our own communities? And how do you see your communities and through your own life and work addressing that? And do you feel like it's successful? In what ways successful, in which ways not as much?
I kind of want to hear what Maida was going to say about that, but I guess I'll go ahead and grease the wheels. I think such a big question and such an unfortunately timely one, sort of given the political moment that we're living through. And I guess I won't focus my comments on that so much as the local situation here in Chicago, because I think that the way that racism manifests it's sort of both very broad, right? Related to processes of imperialism that other speakers have talked about, but it also can have very sort of localized manifestations. And so in Chicago is a sanctuary city and a sanctuary county and a sanctuary state. And so a lot of the anti-deportation activism in Chicago has centered recently around identifying the mechanisms through which people are identified and deported, and in particular the role of local policing agencies, right, and policing migrants. And that's really opened up opportunities for anti-deportation organizers who seek collaborative relationships with Black Lives Matter organizations, because we're all sort of, and I'm not nearly an organizer the way that, community organizers like Maida are, right? But the ways in which organizers find common ground in policing practices that especially target Black and Latinx neighborhoods. And so in Chicago and in Mexico City, there's been an effort to not bypass federal levels, but sort of given the hostility toward immigrant rights organizing at the federal level, there's been a lot of translocal organizing efforts. So connecting organizations that are working, for example, in Chicago and Mexico City, and really bypassing those national level organizations altogether. And so again, in Chicago, one of the more productive anti-racist collaborations that I'm aware of has involved anti-deportation activists working in conjunction with Black Lives Matter activists to identify the role of Chicago's gang database in allowing Chicago police to identify, arrest, and put people into a deportation pipeline, even in the middle of a sanctuary city.
That's a really interesting observation about the level of organizing. And I don't know if, Maida, did you have some perspectives on that as a community organizer and the types of racism and the ways that you encounter that?
Yeah, so we're definitely going through some really, really tough times as a society. And I think that something that we're doing in our organization is to, first of all, address our own biases. I think it's super important to really look internally to analyze how we are contributors, although we are, immigrants, although we are part of the collective people of color. It's super important for us and for me to continue to analyze how our actions, our campaigns might contribute to racism, right? So currently what we're doing internally in our organization is really having those really tough and uncomfortable conversations, right? How are we perpetuating racism? How are biases being contributing to the larger issue of racism? So definitely tough, but I think now more than ever, it's super important to have those conversations, first of all, internally, and then as a collective. I also want to say that as an immigrant rights organizer, and someone that's been fighting for this for a very long time, for more than a decade, I think that we've made a lot of mistakes along the way. However, more than ever, I think that as an immigrant rights movement, we're having those really hard conversations too, right? And what we're doing right now is trying to really attack the root causes of our different causes, right? Of the different things or the different campaigns that we're all fighting for. So I think that right now it's definitely a very crucial moment to take that time to reflect, but also to see how we're going to be making things and how we're going to be strategizing together to really, really, you know, attack and tackle the different systems of oppression.
Great. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists had thoughts. Christina, were you?
Yes, thank you to Myra and Ruth. I wanted to kind of follow up on the localized, the community level organizing that Ruth was talking about in Chicago. I live in Queens, which is, I guess, we tout it as the most diverse county in the country, in New York City. And I found that, especially in this moment, responses, anti-racist responses have really been community level responses, the most effective in terms of, so there's many mutual aids that have popped up in New York City, I know around the country too, where community members have addressed these structural hierarchies that exist, right? So even though there's lots of organizations that serve, you know, populations that have been historically marginalized and disadvantaged, a lot of times those organizations mirror the structures of oppression, right? So that they have, you know, presidents and directors, and those directors are, you know, helping people, right? And the way the aid goes. So mutual aid kind of helps address those structures by community members coming together. And I live in Sunnyside, which is a very, very mixed community in Queens. It was historically Irish, and now we have a lot of community members that are from South America, Paraguay, Colombia, Central America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mexico, and then China, Korea, Bangladesh. So we're a very mixed sort of neighborhood, but mutual aid has come together to kind of help people help each other, right? To come together as a community. And I find that that's, you know, addressing those structures is really, really important in anti-racist work. And one, I guess, project that several community members have come together is in taking land, like a piece of land that is unused and owned. And as you probably know, racist structures are perpetuated by property and property rights. So I have an interest in land rights throughout my research, but, you know, just specifically in New York, right, neighborhoods have been a way to marginalize different populations, right? Keeping, you know, certain neighborhoods, you know, with little access to land ownership or property. So we've collectively, as a community, come together to take this land, and now we're negotiating with the property owners. So I don't condone illegal behavior on the recorded Zoom, but we're in negotiation with the landowners, and we're going to compost and grow vegetables on the land, right? So compost in New York City is a very racist, composting is a racist activity, right? So it typically, trash and compost is collected throughout neighborhoods and sent to neighborhoods, typically Black and brown neighborhoods in other parts of New York, to be processed, right? So your trash is processed elsewhere. And so we're processing, you know, coming together as a community to provide aid to other community members and processing in the community. So I feel like I just wanted to kind of mention that there are very community level. Sometimes we think about policy, and when we think about these structures and, like, you know, and I feel like there's still ways to come together as a community and community organize and really get to the root of some of these racist structures, you know, which involve things like food and trash and land, and how we even help each other, you know, how we don't perpetuate racist structures through that as well.
Thank you. That's some really interesting thoughts about the different levels at which we encounter racism and address it. There was a question that popped up during this conversation and about, it says, do you believe Latinx or Hispanic should be considered a race? And I think that maybe as a panel, maybe a couple of you want to comment on that, but also to give a little background on what would that mean? What would it mean in terms of like a census? What is the difference between the categories that we use of ethnicity and race on those censuses, and what would the implication be? I think that's part of what the question's asking.
As a sociologist and kind of taking a look at these issues as well as others as well, but there is, kind of this debate. Most people think Latinx is a racial group, and it's because of because you always have to explain, in class, especially that, well, Latinas are an ethnic group. All right. But because of their experience, they've been racialized throughout their incorporation into US society. So a lot of people do see them as a race. Whether or not I'm not exactly sure what will happen with categorizations if it ever happened, but we already kind of separate that out. Do you identify as Latinx or Hispanic? Okay. And just as an aside for most people, the term that I prefer the least and do not even like to be labeled as is Hispanic, okay? Because that gives preference to a European experience, which has not been the experience for most Latinx people in the United States, all right? It hasn't been one that's kind of a smooth sailing, type of experience, and, because we've been excluded from jobs as well as other racial ethnic groups, we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic group and things like that. But we've been racialized in the sense that these attributes of, like some people say, criminal, lazy, those types of things, and they attribute to our racial ethnic group. Okay, so I think we already are seen as a racial group. Okay, I don't know for sure, what the big difference for me is, because I can pass for white. I've been mistaken for white many times, and people will ask me if I'm Italian, okay? But I've also, when my beard is fully out, I've also been mistaken for Middle Easterner, okay? And so there's that kind of issue. But as soon as I say my last name, Munoz, okay, and pronounce it right like I always have all my life, even though none of my teachers even tried to pronounce it correctly, and this is going back to the 60s and things like that, before we had this, movement to, hey, let's pronounce people by their right names and things, okay? And so, as soon as they hear that, then they know I'm Latino, and then other stereotypes start kicking in for me, and other treatment, other microaggressions. Oh, you speak English so well. When did you come to the United States? Okay, so those are just some of my thoughts on that. But the racialization process has been going on since, even before the mid 19th century.
Yeah, that's a good point about the racialization's already been going on. I don't know if anybody else had a comment. Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly, just to build on what Ed was saying, that for me, one of the things that is really interesting is the role of immigration. U.S. immigration policy has played historically in creating and cultivating racialized groups, such as, Jews, right, and Irish, and now, now over the course of the last 150 years, the racialization of Latinos has occurred largely, although not completely, through law, right? Through law that disproportionately targets and stigmatizes particular kinds of immigrants from particular kinds of places, that is completely related to this history of US imperialism, right? And so anyway, just as a point, that this racialization process occurs through law, among other things.
That is a good point. So a really good answers to that question. And I love the question. So we have another question that came in. Well, we have a few, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. And this question asks, how do you fight against fear? In particular, the question asks, I'm from Utah, and a few years ago, there was a march for immigrant rights, and most of my family are illegal, and there was fear to go to this march, and possibly, I guess you could say, you could get taken. A lot of people we knew were also afraid to attend, even though a lot of people did show up. So I feel like more could have been done if it wasn't for the fear. So the question is how to fight against fear, and I think we can contextualize this and broaden and say what makes activism successful too, and what are the risks that people take when they do activism, and when they go out and are active in our democratic public sphere, right? And what are the risks and what are the outcomes and things like that. And I know a lot of you guys have this experience, so.
I think I can go. So thank you for that really, great question. So obviously, first of all, I want to share a little bit about my story. So the first time that I actually got activated into activism, obviously, was here in Utah. I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school, and then I'm talking about the early 2000s, right? I was in high school. I was undocumented, and back then, I think that at least a few folks from my generation, we were really afraid to share our status, our immigration status, with other folks, right? So this is, this is before our courageous dreamers that actually went out and say, undocumented, unafraid. So I'm part of a different generation where many of us were really afraid to share our immigration status with teachers, with friends. And I had this really good friend that actually knew that I was undocumented. So it was during lunchtime. This was even before a lot of technology. So, and she came up to me and she said, hey, did you know that there were some arrests? They're taking people like you. Obviously, I was undocumented and some of my family members. So she said, you know what, there is a risk that you're going to be taken away and sent back. And obviously my reaction was like, hey, you know what, let's not talk about that. Let's go to class, right? And then obviously I was very fearful, right? I was 15 years old back then, very fearful, right? And this was at a time where, a lot of our leaders were starting to talk about dreamers, so on and so forth. And I tried to go to class, and I was feeling very uncomfortable and very, very scared. And then I said to myself, you know what, there's something that I need to do with this fear, right? So I decided to go to the march for the first time. I skipped school for the first time, and I actually went. During lunchtime, we went directly to the march. And when I was there, actually in the actual march, there were only very few people. And it was so magical for me to actually just vocalize everything that I was feeling. So at that precise moment actually changed my entire life. It obviously, being undocumented has shaped my values, has shaped the work that I do and why I do it. Being undocumented for 11 years obviously had a great impact on me. Now, working at the leading immigrant rights org in the whole state, it's a very beautiful responsibility. But obviously, it's something that we have to deal with every single day. We've organized so many different marches, throughout the last 21 years of our existence as a nonprofit. And it's hard. It's a really, really, really hard thing to do because obviously, first of all, we need to be very responsible that we need to be taking care of one another. So every time that I organize an action, or that my organization is part of an action, I have to ensure that we have everything in place, right? That we have phone numbers, that we have actual marshals, that we have our own protection, right? That we're actually creating a safe space for our families to be able to vocalize what they're feeling. And it's a hard balance because I believe that obviously there is a lot of power within our own communities. And I also believe that it's important for those of us that now have different kinds of privileges, from status to language to so many other things, to utilize that privilege to actually protect others and allow them to be their own selves, but also to vocalize what they're feeling. So it's hard. Obviously, I'm just going to put that out there. Obviously, I think that organizing in Utah is very different from organizing in Chicago, New York, and DC, right? I've actually had the privilege to organize in different parts of our nation, and it's very different, right? Because obviously our political climate is different within our own state. And, the culture is different. So it's hard, but I think my question and my thought for all of you is, well, then how can I use my privilege to also allow others to get active, but also how can I use my privilege to protect others? I'm just going to leave it at that.
I guess that's a great story, Maida. And to use your privilege, for me, it kind of, to keep spreading the knowledge, all right? You mentioned how you were fearful at first. One of the biggest things I see in my classes, and I teach Chicano Latino experiences, and I also teach courses on criminology, but also looking at social inequality and how that impacts those types of things. But ethnic studies courses are, do wonders for people because they do spread the knowledge that, we've been protesting and marching for our civil rights long before this current era right now, and I was fearful most of the time, didn't want to cause waves when I was in high school. But as soon as I took a Chicano literature course, and the early 70s, I'm dating myself as well. But in any case, that's when I realized, wow, but I always had this kind of, and kind of something that you mentioned, I didn't have the right words to intellectualize what I had experienced my entire life, okay? I came and getting to places like Utah that are primarily white. I grew up in Nebraska, and that's Western Nebraska in a rural area where, it was dominated by white people. But even there was always spaces for us to kind of protest and whatnot. And just to give you another example, it's not even just in the classroom, it's even, at home. My youngest daughter, the middle schooler, probably maybe 2 or 3 months before President Trump was elected, she came home from her mom's after a visit, and she's asked me, "Dad, are we going to move to Mexico?" And I go, "What?" And it just kind of came out of the blue, and there's a whole nother background to that. I says, "But why do you think we have to move to Mexico?" So, well, if President Trump wins, Mom said she's going to move to Mexico. Her mom was born in Mexico, but I told her, I said, sweetheart, this is something you're going to have to learn. And it kind of reminds me of all those stories that, African-American parents have to have with their kids. You have to sit down and talk with your kids about, how long this is going on. And I sat down with her and told her, I said, President Trump, or it wasn't President Trump at that time, but I told her, says, Trump isn't going to be the first person that hated, he isn't the first person that hated Mexicans, and he's not going to be the last. I says, and we're going to do everything that everybody before us did way back since, beginning of time or whatever. I kind of was trying to explain this to her. We're going to stand up and fight for our rights, just like everybody else. And she learns about Martin Luther King, and this is kind of how, I don't want to say biased, what's the correct term? When we talk about multicultural education, there's certain things that are taught, but then everything else gets left out. They don't get no history about Chicano, civil rights era and things like that. So when people, and that's why getting back to what I was mentioning earlier, my students, particularly students that are like first gen, second gen, dreamers, undocumented students, they just love what I teach them because they go, wow, I didn't know this was going on for such a long time. This isn't the first time we were deported. This is like the third, fourth, fifth time that we've been, facing deportation and those types of things. It's been a lifelong thing, the history of La Migra and the whole bit, all this institutionalized violence that Latinos, and Latinas have experienced ever since they've been in the United States. Okay, and so those are the kinds of things you have to keep spreading the knowledge, and not just in the classroom, but at work as well, and also at home. You have to, tell the young ones. And I'm long in the tooth, like I mentioned, and I don't go to as many rallies and marches as I want to, you know, and, but I have my daughters that are coming up, and, you know, I get scared when they go to these marches because I know there's a large police presence there, especially right now. And so I have to, I'll have to admit, I went with my daughter to the Pride March for Black Lives Matter. Okay, and this is kind of gets to that, you know, cross organizing and things like that. And on that day as well, we also had the La Vidas Negras Importan March as well. And it was a beautiful day, multicultural, you know, multiracial. It was great. I'm glad I went. But it's kind of to, you know, show her the ropes, so to speak, or whatever. But now she's going about every other week or whatever. And I'm still scared, frightened of what could happen, but I know there's people there that'll take care of her as well.
Great. We had another question come in, and part of what you were just saying, Ed, kind of touched on this, I think. They asked, to what extent does assimilation, Spanglish comes to mind, enhance or diminish the Latinx experiences and affect prospects for distinctive cultural futures? So thinking about the assimilation or the process of homogenization, how does, and I think maybe each of the panelists maybe can chime in some on this, is we have Hispanic Heritage Month, so to what extent does assimilation impact our desire to maintain cultural heritage and patrimony?
Maybe, can I start? Okay. Great. Well, I again, and maybe even just picking up a bit from the last question, I think, right, the importance of kind of collective action, right, is really, I mean, I don't think it could be underestimated, right? The power of collective action as a way of overcoming fear and at least addressing fear. Not that we can overcome fear necessarily, right? This is a society, I think we have to understand, that is built on fear, right? Through genocide, right? Through enslavement, through the structures of power, through the rule of law, right? The tyranny of the rule of law. Everything is kind of built in that we kind of are fearful. Am I good enough? Am I doing this? Am I right? Self-doubt kind of, it feeds off that self-doubt. And I think, again, as Mayra really beautifully kind of explained, right, the way in which collective action, the role that plays to make people feel as if they're not isolated, right, and that we're not alone. And I think really those are really important lessons, because assimilation, right, and the structures of forced assimilation, right, because by and large, right, in a society like the U.S., assimilation is there's a forced assimilation that goes on, right? Certain standards, quote unquote, that one has to fit to be able to fit into the overall society on that basis, because what we're bringing is not worthy of having and needs then to be left at the door, needs to be erased, right? So the whole purpose of assimilation, the whole structure of assimilation, is a very authoritarian one. It's a very violent one. And so again, I think one way of resisting that is using these spaces, but also to build that collectivity, because assimilation is about individualizing us all as right, we're all equal as individuals, cut off from our roots. So collectivizing it, having these discussions, connecting these dots, right, are a really powerful way of using this space, right? But there's also backlash, right? And we're living under it, right? Where the rhetoric and the actions are getting even tougher. And so all the more reason for the need for collectivity, right? Because the fear is going to be more pronounced.
Thank you, Enrique. I'd like to just pick up on that and kind of echo back to something that Mayra said about using our privilege, right, wherever we are. And many of us on this call are in a structure, a hierarchical structure, right? We're at a university, we're students at a university. So I guess this is sort of like I wanted to think about, not about fear, but about value, right? This collectivity is, and we feel an urge to assimilate because we are not assigning value to some of these cultural practices or the ways that people feel about their identity, right? So, and part of that is because other things hold value, right? And there was a question that was posed to the panelists, I'm not sure that we're gonna get to it, about achievement. And I was thinking about this question, I was gonna push against it because I was like, well, achievement, we're assimilating by subscribing to what achievement means in the university, or what achievement means in our society, right? Did you write a book? Did you win an award? That's an achievement. So you even subscribing to that definition of success is accepting a value system that's outside of your own, right? So in my work, what I do is I try to say, okay, you know, these practices are these collective practice. And I really like that Enrique brought up collectivity, because I think that's really important, right? Success is usually a very individual thing, right? Achievement is very individual. Who's going to get the best grade? Who's going to get the award? You know, only one person can get it, or two people. So it's like distinguishing yourself. And it's kind of ironic that you assimilate to distinguish yourself, rather than this idea of collectivity actually breeding success or health. And I have a story from a student that I involved in some of my research, and I was wanting to, her mother was from Puebla, has lived in the United States. She was born in the United States, a student. And Puebla is a state in Mexico. I think many of you know that, but maybe not everybody. And we were at her house, and and her mother was very confused as to why I wanted to come there and interview her. And she said, well, your professor's in the university, and how is she learning from me? Right? Because there's a hierarchy and a value. And I'm they're learning about how to make pozole and making tamales. And I was like, this is amazing. All of what you're doing, you're learning how to collect yerbas in Central Park. What an achievement. When I was thinking about this achievement question, she was the one I wanted to talk about, as a someone who has achieved something. So I think that collectivity can help us assign value in different ways. And also using positions of privilege, as Myra said, to help reevaluate how we're defining value and how we're defining success, can, I guess, maybe take pressure off these ideas of assimilation, or perhaps, in a way. So I feel like that speaks to a lot of the same questions. Hopefully there was something in there for us to take away. But and if you're a student on this call, pressure your professors. Say, hey, I want to be involved in this, and I need backup. I need your access. I need that. And I think that many of us, I speak for myself, my colleagues, people on this call will provide it for you. Yeah.
We have a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if the other panelists wanted to speak about this question, or had maybe some final thoughts even.
Okay. I did see the one question about what can white people do, all Americans. And I think that's part of why I teach the courses I do as well, because even though we're focusing on Latinx communities right now, we haven't been in these struggles by ourselves, okay? The farm workers movement has a long history working with Asian communities in their struggles as well. And also poor whites, women have been at the forefront of a lot of these struggles. And when things look so bad, as they do right now, I always try to tell my students that, keep the ideology of the United States out there, gets the ideals that are important. That's kind of what keeps people going, in my view, okay? And kind of what keeps going for me, because it's kind of this ebb and flow back and forth, but we also have to find the connections that there's been many struggles, and we've had, and a lot of these struggles have been multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial. And so that's the other part we have. It seems like when we learn our history, it seems like we're always into these binaries, like black, white binary, males versus females, and those types of things. But there's been, a lot of, struggles by, a multitude of peoples in that. And that's what I would like to kind of just find your place, if you feel so strongly about some of these issues, go and participate in a struggle. Folks will let you know how to participate if you want to participate. Okay, sorry.
I would like to, can I just amplify what the other Dr. Munoz said, which is that I think for me, this is absolutely the most important question. What must you do? And if you're not sure where to start, I promise you, there is somebody around you who is working on this issue, and they can use your skills and your talents. And if you don't have anything to contribute, then you can develop some good skills and some good talents, or your time, or your, but there are people, if you are on a college campus, someone around you is doing this work, and you just have to do it. It has to be done.
And lastly, I just want to say that as you're doing that, as you know, as you're trying to be an ally into the different movements and causes, I think it's also important to recognize that communities of color, immigrant communities, women, there is a lot of knowledge within our own communities, and it's super important to recognize that, right? To not come from, you know, with the mentality that, hey, I have the solution, this is what's best for you. I think that's something that we're fighting on the ground is for Comunidades Unidas, and I totally neglected to say this, but I'm super proud that our organization is led by Mujeres Inmigrantes. You know, the majority of us are immigrant, first-generation immigrant mujeres. That's how we identified, and it's, you know, something that we're fighting for every single day is for others to recognize that we have a lot of knowledge. There is a lot of knowledge within our own communities. We've been fighting for a very, very long time. So it's super important also for allies to recognize that it's important to give us our own autonomy. We have the solutions for the problems that we're currently experiencing. So I just want to put that out there because I think it's extremely, extremely important. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Now, I know the panelists, you've been really good about watching your times and things like that, and we are at the hour mark, but I don't want to be too abrupt. And so if there's another kind of burning thought or something, or a bit of advice, because I think that a lot of the questions that we've seen come up in the Q&A are like, well, what do we do and how do we use our privilege? And so if you have any other final thoughts that you feel are burning that you need to share, or a link to where people can advocate in your community or something like that. And I've been putting some links in the chat room, but feel free to drop those in there too.
Just very quickly. I mean, again, everyone I think has said it, you know, beautifully. But really, it's important, I think, especially in these times of heightened fear, right, of real fear around COVID, around, right, the backlash, the political backlash is taking place, that we reach out, right, that we break the wall of fear that's being constructed, that we reach out to each other, right? We can be socially distant, physically distant, but that we reach out and we talk to each other and we listen to each other's stories. Again, right, that is so important to kind of hear people's experiences, to go in, to build empathy, right? Because again, part of our structure in US society has been to erase a lot of our empathy, our feeling of empathy. We don't, right? Empathy is not talked about in K through 12, let alone in university life, right? So I think that's really important, just kind of reaching out and finding connections and finding those spaces. There are mutual aid groups, right? There's other kind of collectives, volunteer work and things like this that could just be a start. There's no right way, right? There's a lot of opportunities, even for a very limited amount of time.
Great. Any other thoughts? Y'all have been an amazing panel. We've talked about everything from identifying terms and how classifications and terms work and what they serve and what they don't do for us, and a little bit of history. We've talked about individual stories. You've shared a lot of your own personal experiences and perspectives. And then we've talked about broader social things, everything from, you know, structural barriers to community level and individual level, connecting and making change and organizing that way, just starting at the individual level and developing empathy and things like this. I think it's been really inspiring for me. And I hope that, thank you to everybody who's been putting comments in the chat and posting questions, and especially to our amazing team of panelists. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Liz, for organizing us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you all for coming.
And I just want to say that if you're passionate about immigrant rights, immigrant justice, please contact me. I just put my email down there. I think it's super important for all of us to come together and continue to fight for justice for everyone, right? Especially right now for communities of color and our low-income community. So muchísimas gracias and thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure meeting you all.
Thank you. All right, adelante for the next one. Good job.